All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to continue our study of women in the Bible tonight. Tonight, if you go on the church's Facebook page, you'll see an itinerary of all the women in the Bible that we're going to be covering. It's quite a few of them, and I'll get us all the way through December. And tonight we are going to go to the book of Genesis and look at Sarah. We're basically doing these in a chronological order, the order in which they appear in the Bible, these women. And so Sarah would be the next one. Eve was obviously the first one, and we covered her last week, had a really good study on that, so we're going to continue with Sarah tonight. Let's start off by going to the New Testament, the book of 1 Peter, chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, and if I could have a volunteer read the first 6 verses. So 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Through verse 6, please. Mm-hmm. So it seems that Peter is speaking very highly of Sarah here. He is telling wives to be submissive to their own husbands. He's saying that even Christian wives, even if some of you would have husbands disobedient to the word, which, that could be a non-Christian husband. It could be a Christian husband that is involved in some sin. You could still win them over without a word when they observe your respectful conduct. He is telling Christian women in verses 3 and 4 that their focus should not be on how they look outwardly, which is generally something that's very important to women, how they look outwardly, but that the focus should be on how they look inwardly. Verse 4, the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. And then in verses 5 and 6, he brings it back to Sarah in the Old Testament. This is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their husbands. And he gives Sarah as an example, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children. Some translations say you are her daughters, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So Peter is basically praising Sarah for the respect that she gave to her husband. And he's not the only New Testament writer to do this. If you go to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that's usually called the Hall of Faith, or the Hall of Fame of Faith. The writer of Hebrews cites many Old Testament characters who and cites their faith in God as exemplary and commendable. Sarah is mentioned here. If you go to Hebrews chapter 11, and if I could have a volunteer read verse. Now, what we're going to see in our study tonight is that this faith that Sarah is said to have here, the faith in God to miraculously give her a child when she was well past the age for bearing children, that's not as cut and dry a thing as we might think. Human beings are complex, wouldn't you say? And do you know anyone who is completely 100% good? That they have absolutely no flaws whatsoever? Of course not, right? And really, when you think about it, the opposite could be said too. Do you know anyone who is 100% evil, that they're in every single aspect of their life, that there is no, they've never done anything commendable, they have absolutely no positive trait or quality about them? Do you know anyone like that? I don't. Human beings are complex, and it's very easy when we read in the Bible, especially here in Hebrews chapter 11, we read by faith, Sarah, she received power to conceive. She considered him who promised her well past the age of childbearing a son to be faithful. And we might look at her and say, and the rest of these, by faith, Abraham offered up Isaac. We might look at them and say, well, you know what, they seem to have a relationship with God and a faith in God and a piety and a spirituality that I just could never attain because I am very much aware of my flaws. But what we're going to see tonight is Abraham and Sarah, their faith is commended here in Hebrews chapter 11. But it doesn't mean that their faith did not have its ups and downs. Just like with Eve. Usually, last week when we looked at Eve, usually what we tend to do is we focus right on that big mistake that she made, the sin that she committed, giving into Satan's temptations and believing his deceit. But what we saw in our study last week about Eve is that there were positive traits about her as well, which we don't really focus on in Sunday school. And in like manner, we look at Hebrews chapter 11 and 1 Peter chapter 3. Well, Sarah, she was the type of wife or the type of woman or the type of follower of God that maybe I could not be. Because look at her. She just seemed to have it all together. Well, when you closely examine her life, as we are going to do in a succinct way tonight, you'll see that that's not the case. Her faith was commended, but her faith had its ups and downs. And that tells us something about the Christian faith. Our faith can and does have its ups and downs. And yet we can still be commendable to God. So let's go to Genesis chapter 11. This is the first time we read of Sarah towards the end of the chapter. Genesis chapter 11, I'm going to read it. I was going to read starting with verse 27. Genesis 11, verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Ishka. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Just want to throw this out for feedback, especially from the ladies here in the class. Have any of you ever had any experience, any trouble with conceiving a child? You ever wondered if you would ever have a child? My mother, my dad and my mom tried for many years to have a child. My mother went through a lot of miscarriages. She also went through a stillborn. They despaired of, finally, after years of trying, they despaired of ever having a child. And so they adopted my brother. And then about 2 years later, my sister came along, and from what I was told, that was a completely normal, healthy pregnancy and delivery. And then about 11 years later, I came along. I'm told that I was planned. I think I was a surprise, but I nearly died when I was born. I had to spend the first month or so of my life in this world outside the womb in an incubator. I took my first helicopter ride when I was 30 minutes out of the womb from one hospital in Nashville to the other side, to a hospital on the other side of Nashville, because they had the equipment to save my life. There was a membrane that was covering my lungs that kept me from breathing like I should. I was told that the same doctor that worked on John F. Kennedy's baby, unsuccessfully the baby died, that he just happened to be in town. And he was like the premier children's doctor in the country, and they called him, and he worked on me and saved my life. But my mother knows what it's like to be in Sarah's shoes here. Now, Sarah, at this point, has had no child. The promise of her having children has not been given yet. She eventually will have a child after thinking that it's not going to happen. But there's a despair, there's an emptiness, there's a loneliness, there's a feeling of inadequacy that many women who are barren feel. When they look at other women who do have children, there's a sense of jealousy that comes there. I knew a woman who had one child, and her and her husband wanted another child. They wanted more children desperately, but there was something wrong with her inner works in her womb, and she was told by the doctors after a couple of surgeries and after several attempts, you're never going to have another child ever again. It's just going to be impossible. And I watched, it wasn't long after she received this news that Beth became pregnant with our first, Katie, and then 2 years later became pregnant with Ashlyn. And I could see this woman watching her, and Beth and I would do our best to be considerate of her. But you could see sometimes, like at the baby shower or the gender reveal party or things like that, you would see tears come up into her eyes as she realizes that she is not going to experience again what we're experiencing. It's a burden on women when they cannot have children. So I, at being male, of course, I don't even approach the ballpark of being able to understand that. I'm just sharing with you my feeble attempts to try to explain it. But many women know exactly what Sarai was going through here, and when it says that she was barren. So that's one thing to keep in mind about this woman of faith, this woman of submission. Faith does not shield you from problems. Faith does not shield you from hardship. Faith does not shield you from trials and tribulations of life, disappointments, loneliness, burdens, despair. Sarai experienced that in spite of her faith. Here's something else to consider. Let's keep reading in chapter 11. We stopped at verse 30. Let's read verse 31 and following. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. I want some feedback from the ladies here too. Again, being male, I have no claim on being a master of understanding the female disposition, the female mind. But here's one thing that I have been told. And ladies, you just tell me if I'm wrong. Okay? One thing that your average woman, your average wife, your average mother generally really looks for and craves is security. Is that true? I'm seeing some nodding heads. So does it promote security to, number one, leave your hometown, Ur of the Chaldeans, which history tells us and archaeology tells us that Ur of the Chaldeans was one of the most, for its day in those ancient times, it was one of the most technologically advanced cities in the ancient world. They had, from what I've read, they'd had plumbing and running water and things of that nature. It was a good place to live, apparently. You leave there. Your husband comes in one day and says, Dad wants to move us all. We're just going off. Well, where are we going? We're going someplace far away to this land that's hundreds of miles away. And then you take off. You go out into the barren wilderness. And you don't even get to the land where you're going to. You stop at this other place for a while. And then your father-in-law, the guy whose idea this was to get up and move, he dies. And then after he dies, at some point, suddenly your husband, picture this, your husband just rushes into the tent. And he says, God himself just spoke to me. We're not going to stay here. We're going to go to this land that he's going to show me where it is. We're just going to head off there. And someday, somehow, this land will belong to our descendants. Does that promote security? I mean, remember, if you're Sarai, you're barren. So your husband saying that God says, I will make a great nation of you. Wouldn't you, if you were Sarai, wouldn't you just say, you do realize that we don't have any children and we can't have children? Think that would have crossed your mind? Do you think it would have crossed your mind that you mean we're going, even after your dad has passed away and it was his idea for us to leave home, we're not going back home, we're going even further away from home? And you're not even really sure where we're going, you're just going to wait till God tells you that you got there? Would that be something hard for you as a wife to deal with? And let's say that you were initially okay with this. I mean, moving is one of the easiest jobs in the world, isn't it? Especially for a wife. I mean, whenever you decide to move, it's really a piece of cake, isn't it? Right? You all are smiling at me. Yeah. It's one of the hardest undertakings. And is moving stressful? Have any of you moved and not known where you were going? You had a place in mind usually, didn't you? Didn't you usually have a house or an apartment or some lodging already picked out with the paperwork signed so that you had the right to be there? You at least had that security. Your husband, or maybe you yourself, you probably had a job waiting for you where you were going, so at least you can count on that, right? But it's still, in spite of all that, it's still pretty stressful, right? Sarai didn't even have that. because she didn't know where she was going. She was depending on a promise that an unseen God gave, not to her directly, not yet, but rather to her husband, who reported it to her secondhand. And the promise had to do with going to this place that God would make theirs, and that God would make a great nation out of them, and yet you just can't get past it in your mind that you can't have children. So do you think you would have any trouble believing in this? I would. There's no mention here at this point that Sarah believed in God's promise here. That comes later. But one thing that does go along with it is what Peter was talking about, that Peter talked about her submission to her husband. If I was in Sarah's shoes, I would have very grave misgivings about what my husband wanted to do here. But she went along with it. She went along with it. That's an indication, somewhat, of her faith. A positive indication. So we see some positive attributes here, and we also see something, when you really stop and you try to put yourself in Sarah's shoes here, you see an indication here of how difficult it may have been. But it doesn't stop there, because as we're about to read, she made mistakes too. In fact, you're in chapter 12. If you keep reading through the first 9 verses, you'll see that they came to the promised land. They came to the land of Canaan. And when they got to the land of Canaan, look at verse 10. Was everything wonderful? I mean, they got there. They're here. They can relax, right? It's going to be fine from here on out. No, what's verse 10? What's the first thing that they encounter once they finally get to this land that God has promised to their descendants? What? A famine. Again, women, do you tend to want and crave security, right? Does it make you feel very secure when you're in the middle of a famine, in the middle of a place you've never been before? You're completely unfamiliar with this area. There are bandits out there scrounging for food that you don't have. Would you be anxious? Sure you would. So what do? They leave the land that God had promised them, and they go down to Egypt. Now, I want you to go back to the first part of chapter 12. Verse 1. What did God say to Abram? Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. Can God do that if they're dead? No. Famine has the potential of killing them, right? Now look at verse 10. Is there any indication that God directed them to go to Egypt? It just says that they went to Egypt. What this could be is an indication of a weak faith. Their faith had been, to some degree, strong enough to make the journey out into the great unknown, hundreds of miles, to a place they'd never been before, continuing on even past his father's death, her father-in-law's death. And then they finally get there, and the first big hurdle that comes their way, once they've gotten there though, what happens? Their faith falters. They don't trust God enough to stay in the land that he promised them and trust that he would get them out of this, that he would provide for them anyway, and thereby be able to keep his promise that he made to them. No, they take matters into their own hands. It's not going to be the first time that it happens, as we'll see. So they go down to Egypt. And when they enter Egypt, verse 11, Abram said to Sarai his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and when the princess of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Now, Abram is in fear of his life. Sarai, at this point, Abram's 75 years old, Sarai's 65. She's apparently still a very beautiful woman. Keep in mind that she will die at age 127, so she's still generally, if you look at the whole of her life, she's in the prime of her life. Also, one thing to keep in mind is Eastern women at this stage, they would wear veils covering their faces all the time. Like they wouldn't go without it every single day, all day, for as long as the sun was up. Women would generally wear a veil. It would protect their face from the Middle Eastern harsh sun, and it would preserve their face. It would help keep, even up into their 60s, it would help keep their faces relatively smooth and free of cracks and wrinkles and the like. So if you were wondering why the Egyptians could think that this is a very beautiful woman when she's 65, that at that time in history, that was quite common. She was still in the prime of her life generally. But notice, Abram's afraid of his life. They're gonna think, understandably, that you're beautiful, Sarah. They're going to, if I say that you're my wife, they're going to kill me so that they could have you. So just to spare my life, I want you to lie for me and say that you're my sister, which, as we would find out later, is not a 100% complete lie, because she was in fact his sister, his half-sister, same father, different mothers. But that was not her primary role, was it? She was his wife. So he is asking her to basically lie to save his life, even though, again, God had already promised this man that he would make a great nation out of him, and God can't do it if he's been killed, can he? So what does that say about Abram's faith in God? At this point in his life, what was it? Strong or weak? Weak. What was it earlier? What was it that motivated him to go ahead and leave and head out into the great unknown when God told him to do it? What was his faith, strong or weak then? Strong. Strong at one point, weak in another. Let me ask you this. Does that describe your faith in your life? Have there been times when your faith has been strong, and have there been other times when it hasn't been? And have those times, have they been like back to back, one right after the other? That's life, isn't it? What's a lesson we can learn from Sarai and Abram here? You know what? Hebrews puts them in the hall of fame of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. I want you to understand something about the men and women of the Bible who had faith that God commends. They were not superhuman. They were just like you. And they were just like me. They had times in their life when they were strong spiritually, and they had times in their life when they were weak spiritually. We see that with Sarai here. Now let's continue on. Skip over a couple of chapters to chapter 16 of Genesis. Here's what happens in the interim. They go back to Canaan, which is the land that God promised to Abram and his nephew Lot. Am I correct there? Or was it just to Abram? It was just to Abram. But Abram brought Lot with him, and what we see in chapter 13, it basically it's like the Western stereotype. The town ain't big enough for the both of us. The land ain't big enough for the both of us. Abram does something very selfless here. He lets Lot choose which portion of the land to stay in, the land that God promised him. Lot chooses the better part. Lot chooses the more prosperous, more fruitful part. I want to ask you something. Ladies, if you were Sarai, if you were Abram's wife, would you have gone along with that decision? Your husband walks in and says, "You know what? We just can't. Lot and us, we just can't stay here." And you like, "Oh, so are you going to kick him out? Are you going to tell him to go?" "No, I gave him the best part of the land, and we're just going to take the not as good part over here." Would you have gone along with that? Would you have been happy with that? She apparently went along with it. Again, what did Peter recommend about Sarai? Her submissiveness. You know, one thing about submissiveness, whether it be a wife to a husband, whether it be a member of a local congregation to an eldership, whether it be you as an employee to your boss, whether it be you as a Christian to the Lord, sometimes the person that you're submitting to makes a decision that you don't agree with. Right? Now you might even think is kind of not the right way to go, to put it charitably, right? But she went along with it anyway. It teaches us a lot about submission here. That's in chapter 13. Chapter 14, Lot pays the price for going over to that more fruitful area. That's where Sodom was. Sodom gets into a war. The enemy army captures Lot. Abram goes off with 300 of his servants, and in a daring rescue, they rescue Lot. At the end of chapter 14, you have Melchizedek, a priest of the God Most High, as well as a king. Both him and the king of Sodom want to give gifts to Abram as a result. Abram completely rejects the king of Sodom's gift. I do not want to accept that. And then Abram gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything he owns. Again, if you're Abram's wife, ladies, what's your thoughts? You just saved these people. You just basically won their war for them, and you're not letting them give you a reward. In fact, you are giving one of them a tenth of everything we own. But she submitted. She submitted anyway. Chapter 15. God, for the first time, really gets specific here. And he tells Abram that he is going to have an heir. He's going to have a child, that his offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Now, Do you know how long it is between chapter 12, when he first gives the inkling of that promise, and chapter 15 and 16? There's a 10-year gap there, a decade. And they have no children yet. Do you think that maybe Sarah might have been wondering, is God really going to come through with this? It's been 10 years. 10 years. And I'm getting older. You look at chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, which is an exact contradiction to what God had just told her husband in the previous chapter. And if you read chapter 15, God not only told him, God did something pretty supernatural and miraculous to seal the deal as a sign of the covenant. And yet Sarai, is her faith here strong or weak at this point? It's weak. It's weak. So what does she do? If you continue reading in chapter 16, she offers one of her female slaves, her mistress Hagar, and says to Abram, look, you go in and basically you have relations with my mistress, with my handmaiden, with my slave, my servant, so that I can have children through her. She'll bear the children and then they will be mine. Look at the last part of verse 2. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. When I read this, the first thing that comes in my mind is, this was your idea. It was your idea that this happened. But notice how she's saying to Abram, this is your fault. Did he bear some of the responsibility? Sure. He went along with it. But at the same time, she's acting as if there's no responsibility on her shoulders here, and that's not the case at all. Again, this is showing that the men and women of the Bible that we teach our kids in Sunday school that they should be like because of their faith, they were human. Have you ever done anything that when you really are honest with yourself, you know that it was your fault, but you put the blame on someone else? Have you ever done that at all in your life? Sure you have. We all have. And that's what she did here as well. We see in verse 6 that Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, which might indicate physical abuse, because Hagar, the slave, runs away as well. Now, who knows the name of the son that Hagar had? Ishmael. And Ishmael was the ancestor of whom? Do you know? Ishmael was the ancestor of basically the whole Arabian nation, the whole Arabian culture. And Sarai eventually would have a son, right? He was Isaac. And Isaac, his descendants would be whom? Isaac had a son whose name started with a J. Your kids in Sunday school, they're beating you on Bible trivia. Who was Isaac's son that started with a J? Y'all know? Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to what? Israel. And today, the nation of Israel and the Arab nations around Israel, they get along wonderfully, don't they? No, they don't. For thousands of years, there has been lots of strife in the Middle East between the Jews, Isaac's descendants, and the Arabs, Ishmael's descendants. We know that to be the case even today, right? What we're seeing here is the source of it. How different would history be and our world be today if Sarai had not come up with the idea to run ahead of God, if Sarai had not gotten impatient with God and come up with her own plan? How different would the world be today if Sarai's faith at this point in her life had been just a little bit stronger? It's something to contemplate. Now you keep reading. Hagar eventually, an angel of the Lord has Hagar come back. Hagar has Ishmael. They stay for the moment in Abram's household. In chapter 17, God makes a covenant, specifically promises that Isaac would be born to Sarah, changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. Sarai, I've been told, means barren mountain, which is fitting because she was barren. Sarah, however, means princess of many, which goes along with the promise that God had given her. And by this point, do you know how many years has it been since when he first made this promise in chapter 12? And now he is saying in chapter 17, by this time next year, you're going to have a son through Sarah. You know how many years has it been? It's been 25 years. Is that a long time? It's a long time. Abraham is now 99 years old. He'll be 100 years old the following year when Isaac's born. Sarah is 10 years younger, so she's in her 90s. But God is still promising them this. Now go to chapter 18. In chapter 18, the Lord and two angels visit Abraham and Sarah. I want you to look at verse 9. They said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." The way that it's written in the Hebrew, when she's laughing, she's away. She's not like right there. She's like inside the tent, listening. The door's closed. So she's thinking that she's eavesdropping in private. And the way that the Hebrew is written, it wasn't a laugh that was a laugh out loud, verbal laugh. No, it's more like a mental. She's mentally laughing to herself in her mind. But the Lord, being the Lord, knows that she laughs anyway. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Again, what state is her faith in at this point? Is it strong or is it weak? It's weak. It's weak. But if you skip over to chapter 20, and we'll just, because of time, I'm just going to summarize chapter 20. Do you remember when they went down to Egypt and Abraham told Sarah to lie so that the king would spare his life? Hey, say you're my sister instead of my wife. Well, now they go to the land of the Philistines, and she's pregnant at this time. God is fulfilling his promise. But guess what Abraham does? He asks her to lie again. Hey, tell the king that you're my sister, so that he'll spare my life. And God, again, visits a plague upon the king, tells the king what's what. The king gets very, very angry at Abraham, and basically makes him leave his country again. So, Abraham and Sarah, at times their faith is strong. I'm thinking that when Sarah, in her 90s, when she first feels that kick in her stomach, and she's beginning to show, maybe her faith gets stronger again. Wouldn't you say? This is actually happening. God is actually miraculously giving Abraham and I a child. He's fulfilling his promise. If he's fulfilled his promise about giving me a child in my old age, then he'll continue to keep his promise and make of our descendants a great nation, which means that this land will be ours, that he will keep us safe, that he won't let anyone kill us. But then when their lives are put in the potential for danger, their faith drops down again, and they lie. Just like how it is with you and me. At times, our relationship with God is strong, and our resistance to temptation and sin is strong, and then, at times, it isn't. That's why God says in the New Testament, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Chapter 21, Isaac is born. Abraham, verse 5, is 100 years old. So Sarah is 90 years old when Isaac is born. Look at verse 6. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me, because that's what the name Isaac means. It means laughter. Do you think it had anything to do with Sarah laughing earlier to herself? God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Again, do you think her faith is strong at this point? Certainly. She's seeing the promise being fulfilled. But then you keep reading, though. The child grew and was weaned, verse 8, so he's probably around 3-4 years old. It's a day of feasting on the day that Isaac was weaned. But then Sarah sees Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. There's jealousy there, which, if you had to share your husband with another woman, and now if you see that your son that you've waited all your life to have is going to have to share his father with your slave's son, would there be jealousy? Yes, but again, whose idea was this originally, all those years earlier? It was her idea. Now, at this point, Ishmael is probably in his teens. He's probably at least 13 years old. So 13 years later, there's still strife in Abraham's family. Sarah is still reaping what she had sowed. Again, a great lesson for us as well. Our faith goes through periods of ups and downs. There are times when we are very obedient to God. There are times when we fail to obey God. When we fail to obey God, there are consequences to that. And even when we repent, as I have no doubt that Sarah repented, those consequences can be long-lasting still. As we continue our study of women in the Bible, we're going to be examining women and men in the Bible, and we will see this play out. Now, last thing I'm going to mention here, she says to Abraham to cast out the slave woman with her son, For this son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Now notice verse 11. This is displeasing to Abraham because remember, this is Ishmael's Abraham's son. He might not be Sarah's son, but he's Abraham's son. This was hard on Abraham. Do you think it put some strain on their marriage? More than there already was? I'm sure that it did. But God goes along with Sarah here. And so Abraham dismisses Hagar, and she goes out, and God takes care of her and Ishmael. But again, we see the consequences of a weak faith. Even though, just due to us being human, it is sure to happen, the consequences can be severe. So it's what we see from Sarah's life as we close this lesson tonight is that what the New Testament writer said about her is true. She is a model of submission, including submission to her husband when her husband made decisions that put much strain on her and much anxiety on her, as it would any woman. She is also a model of faith, because it does say in Hebrews 11 that she did have faith in God. But what we do learn about her faith and Abraham's faith is that while their faith was strong at times their faith was weak. At times they trusted in God so much that they waited on Him, even if it took 25 years. And at times their faith was weak so that they grew impatient and they tried to take matters into their own hands with results that were disastrous, putting a strain on their marriage, and results that we are still feeling even today with the strife that's happening in the Middle East. So there's a lot that Sarah and Abraham can teach us about faith and about what it means to be a follower of God who is human. You know, it says in the Bible, he who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. And what that is God's way of saying what the life of Sarah and Abraham show us. You are going to stand in your faith at times. You are going to be very close to me and dedicated to me and loyal to me. But don't get cocky. Don't think that you are beyond falling for Satan's temptations. Because sooner or later, there's going to come a time in your life where your faith will falter and you will stumble and fall. But just as Abraham and Sarah picked themselves up with God's hand and kept moving forward and kept stumbling and falling and kept picking themselves up again even more, we too can do the same. We too can do the same. Next week is Lot's wife. So be reading Genesis chapter 19 to study Lot's wife, and we'll talk about her. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we are grateful to have this time to study your word, and we ask, Father, that you help our faith. When our faith is strong, we pray that you will help us to keep it strong, and when our faith falters and grows weak, be patient with us and merciful, forgive us, and help us to have a strong faith again. Continue to watch over us. Continue to bless us in your own good time, not in ours, as we learned from Abraham and Sarah tonight. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for your attention, for coming.